The next book is Peter and the Tree Children by Peter Wolleben, best-selling author of The Hidden Life of Trees, and illustrated by Cale Atkinson. It is dedicated to the little ones who love the tree children and to all those giving nature the care and respect it deserves. Interesting that this one was first published in a foreign language and then it's got a translated attribution as well. Jane Billinghurst. A note for you before we step into the forest. I live in a forest in Germany where I often tell stories to the children about the animals and the trees. Pete the squirrel is a real squirrel. Every day he scampers about in the tops of the trees growing around my forest lodge or in the meadow nearby. In winter, I put food out for him under an old pine tree, and in summer he plays with the other squirrels in the treetops. The ancient beech trees with their children aren't far away either. Behind my lodge, there is a preserve where the beeches can grow undisturbed. In this protected spot, no one is allowed to cut down any trees, and it is always beautifully shady and cool. I need a special story for this book, and I immediately thought of Pete. In this story, Pete is curious about families since he doesn't have one of his own. He can't believe that even trees have families. He asks me to show him, and so we set out on our search for the tree children. Are you ready to make the journey with Pete to find the tree children? Yes? Then I will begin the story. We are lucky that Cale has painted absolutely wonderful pictures so you can see all the places we're going to visit. I hope you enjoy our adventure. Pete Wolleben. Every morning, before Peter the forester went out into the woods, he sat on the bench in front of his house. He sipped his coffee, listened to the birds sing, and watched the sun rise over the forest. One day, a squirrel scampered up and sat down next to him as though they were old friends. Its black eyes were brimming with tears. "What's the matter?" asked Peter. He wasn't expecting a reply, but to his surprise, the squirrel said, "I'm all alone. I don't have any family." Peter looked carefully at the squirrel. "That's hard," he said gently. "My children no longer live in the forest with me, but I still have the trees. Did you know that they have families too?" "Really?" said the squirrel. Peter nodded. "Tree parents live with their children." "I didn't know that," said the squirrel, perking up. "Can you show me these tree children?" Peter thought, then nodded. "I haven't seen any tree families lately, but we could look for them together." "Yes, let's," the squirrel exclaimed. "Come along then," said Peter. "By the way, I'm Peter." The squirrel laughed. "Perfect, because I'm Pete." With that, he leaped off into the forest. "Wait!" called Peter. "I can't move as fast as you." But Pete had already disappeared behind the nearest tree. Peter trudged along after him, his heavy boots making the leaves rustle. All of a sudden, it was really bright. They were in a clearing full of red flowers. Pete peeked out from behind a stinging nettle where a family of caterpillars was happily munching. "Where are the tree children?" he asked. "It's much too hot for them here in the sun," replied Peter. "We have to go deeper into the forest." Pete ran ahead again until... Ew! Muddy tire tracks stretched across the forest floor. "Can you carry me, Peter? I don't want my paws to get all dirty." Peter nodded, and Pete climbed up onto his shoulder. They heard a rumbling in the distance. Peter followed the sound along the tracks. When they got to the end, there was a big machine busy cutting down trees. Peter shook his head sadly. "We won't find any tree children here either. Look, the machine is packed the soil down so much that little trees can't grow in it." Pete sighed and climbed down from Peter's shoulder. For a long time they walked through the forest together in silence until they heard a sound in the distance. Hop, hop, hop! Pete's nose twitched. Is that a bird? Peter smiled. No, that's my friend Dana and her horse. Branches snapped and the two of them appeared. Whoa, Watan! The horse stopped. A short rest for you, my friend, said Dana, stepping out from behind the horse. She shook Peter's hand. What have you got here? Pete stood up on his hind legs. I'm Pete, and I'm looking for the tree children. Ah, I see. Dana looked thoughtful. I haven't seen any for a while. At least I won't have muddy paws here, said Pete. The horse doesn't leave deep tracks. Peter picked up a handful of soil and let it run through his fingers. Without machines, the earth stays soft and loose, he explained. Your trees are lucky, Pete told Dana. Then he bounded over to Peter. Come on! We've got tree children to find. After a while, Peter stopped to pick wild berries for a snack. I prefer the seeds in pine cones, started Pete, when suddenly a big bird swooped past. Help! A hawk! Pete jumped into Peter's arms. Hey, off with you! Peter shouted at the bird. The hawk flapped its wings, releasing a shower of small feathers and wheeled around and disappeared. Pete peered out from Peter's arms. Is it gone? Yes, I think he's returned to his nest, said Peter. So even he has a family, said Pete quietly. Can you carry me in your jacket? Pete whispered as he looked up into the treetops. Of course, said Peter. A narrow path led steeply uphill. The trees up high were small and twisted. Eventually, the slope was bare. This is a lovely place, but trees can't grow where there's no soil, said Peter. Oh, look at that, Pete called and bounded down to a clearing. Peter's face turned bright red. Someone has cut down all the old trees. What a terrible mess. Aren't those tree children? Asked Pete. He sniffed one of the seedlings the tree planters had planted. They smell nice, a bit like oranges. They only smell good to us, said Peter. This smell is how trees talk to each other, and it means the trees don't feel so well. They miss being shaded and protected by their families. Pete glanced down. The poor little trees. This is not how I imagined it at all. Some trees have a hard life, said Peter sadly, but let's see if we can find some happy ones. Slowly, Pete followed Peter. Finally, they arrived in an old beech forest. The silvery gray trees formed a roof of leaves way up high. The forest was cool and dark. Pete pointed to small green wings fluttering above the ground. Look, there are butterflies everywhere. Peter laughed. No, those aren't butterflies. Those are freshly sprouted beech children. I know how they got here, Pete giggled. I hid a lot of beech nuts here last fall, so I'd have enough to eat over the winter. And then I forgot where I buried them. Pete couldn't stop smiling. Beech children with their parents, a beautiful forest. Pete bounded onto his knee. The most beautiful forest of tree children ever, and we've found it. The sky was beginning to turn orange. Time to go home, said Peter. When they returned to the forest lodge, Peter made himself a cup of coffee and a snack for Pete. But Pete didn't want a snack. He hung his head. Pete, you're still upset. A tear rolled down the squirrel's nose. Everyone has a family, even the trees. Everyone but me. Peter set down his mug. He lifted Pete up so he could look him in the eye. I may not be a squirrel, but I like you very much. Do you want to stay with me? Pete's eyes grew wide. Does that mean we're family now? Of course, said Peter. And we can go and visit the trees again tomorrow? Asked Pete. Of course, Peter said again with a chuckle, and they sat together on the bench, watching the sunset over the forest. The end.